Hello, everyone. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Today's webinar topic is bridging the gaps, determining when clinical data is necessary to demonstrate conformity with GSPRs. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? If you'd like to speak with us about your upcoming project or regulatory writing needs, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free 30-minute consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. You can also book a meeting time directly with the link that we will now send in the chat. We have two presenters today. First, I'll welcome Dr. Sarah Chavez. She's the Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Also presenting today is Stacy Beecham, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Stacy has a BS in biology and an MS in human physiology with extensive experience in regulatory writing and 10 years of experience in international regulatory affairs. Stacy was a medical researcher prior to entering the regulatory space, where she worked with physicians and scientists at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Stacy's expertise in regulatory affairs, submission writing, clinical research, and regulatory consulting for medical device, biopharma, and biotech makes her a valuable asset to our team. Welcome, Stacy. And now I will turn it over to Sarah to give an overview of our session today.
Okay, thank you, Olivia, and thank you to everyone on the call today. In today's session, we're hoping to review the MDR guidance regarding definitions, classifications, and regulation of medical devices. But we will also discuss some of the new guidance that's been recently published regarding the same topics for IVDR, for those of you on the call who are from the IVDR world. And specifically, we hope to discuss the situations in which a device may be exempted from clinical investigations and provide you with some examples. So in today's presentation, we will discuss the definitions of legacy, well-established technology, and other devices covered under MDR Article 52 or Article 61. And then we will review alternative routes to conformity that may not require clinical investigations. And we hope to describe these strategies from both a regulatory perspective, but also a writer's perspective, and how you're going to organize this information. According to MedDev Rev 4, a clinical evaluation is based on a comprehensive analysis of available pre- and post-market clinical data that's relevant to the intended purpose of the device in question. So that will include things like safety and performance data. Every medical device intended for market in the EU will require a clinical evaluation. And in many of our previous webinars, we have tried to describe these 5 stages of the clinical evaluation process, but we keep noticing the same question comes up regarding that stage 1. What do I do if there is no data? Or more directly, we get the question of how do I avoid needing to conduct a clinical evaluation or a clinical investigation for my particular device if there is no data? Now, MDR states that a device group may not require clinical investigations under certain circumstances, and that could be if sufficient clinical evidence exists and the device meets specific criteria. So a thorough clinical evaluation should examine all non-clinical data, including things like bench data, chemical characterization, biocompatibility testing, preclinical animal study data, and ultimately, and hopefully, human clinical data. If sufficient clinical evidence already exists for your device, you may not need to conduct additional clinical trials. But for some devices, the systematic literature review process may not come up with any published data. So today, in the event that you fall under that category, we'd like to discuss another route to conformity that involves using non-clinical data to help you demonstrate conformity, and it does not necessitate the use of clinical data at all. So I will turn it over to Stacy to elaborate on that.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, as Sarah said, devices can demonstrate conformity to the general safety and performance requirements in a variety of ways, but for some device groupings, the MDR does specify that there would not be a need to conduct clinical investigations to support this demonstration of conformity. For example, wet devices, legacy devices, and devices covered under Article 6110. We will go into further details about these device groupings and the regulations, but let's first decide which devices are or are not regulated as a medical device under the MDR. It is also important to remember that these designations under the MDR are simply routes to conformity, but they do not exempt the manufacturer from other relevant requirements such as clinical evaluation reports, post-market surveillance, and other monitoring and reporting requirements. The MDR defines a medical device as any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended to be used for either diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of disease, disability, or injury where prevention of disability and injury is excluded, or investigation, replacement, or modification of an anatomical, physiological, or pathological process, or providing data via in vitro examination of samples derived from a human body. But there are also other types of products that are regulated as medical devices in the EU. Here are some examples. For example, disinfectants and sterilizers for medical devices, contraceptive devices, and software that is necessary for the function of the medical device. Examples of products that are not regulated as medical devices would be products using viable biological components as their intended purpose, IVDs, medicines, cosmetics, and food, and software that is used for non-medical purposes. There are additional products that are considered medical devices now under the MDR. Sarah will walk us through these lesser known medical device groups.
So I would imagine some of you are joining today because you fall under one of these categories, where you were a previously unregulated product that's now regulated as a medical device under the MDR. Under Annex 16 devices, these are aesthetic devices. So things like contact lenses, tattoos, liposuction, they were all previously unregulated under the MDD, but now they fall under MDR. So those will include contact lenses or other products used in or on the eye, products introduced into the body via surgically invasive means in order to modify the anatomy, products and substances used for facial or subcutaneous filling, equipment used for liposuction, lipolysis, or lipoplasty, high-intensity electromagnetic radiation equipment used for skin treatment, such as tattoo or hair removal, and equipment using electrical or magnetic currents to stimulate the brain. The second group here are accessories. An accessory to a medical device is defined by the MDR as an article which, while itself not being a medical device, is intended by its manufacturer to be used together with one or several parts enable the medical device to be used in accordance with its intended purpose, or to specifically and directly assist the medical functionality of the medical device in terms of the intended purpose. So a few examples of that would be tools for calibrating medical devices, special supports, or even remote controls for operating tables. The third group here are combination products. So those are products that are composed of any combination of an ancillary drug, device, or biologically active product. So those will include things like drug-eluting stents. Borderline products are the last group here, and those are products where it's not clear from the outset whether or not it is a medical device, an in vitro diagnostic medical device, an active implantable medical device, or not. Or if your product falls within the definition of a medical device, but it is excluded from the directives by the scope. So this may be, an example of this may be a wearable heart monitor that does not communicate with the doctor or the hospital. That could fall under a fitness device or a consumer product, but it could also serve a medical purpose. Once you know whether or not your product is regulated as a medical device in the EU, the next step is to evaluate the clinical evidence and determine whether or not a clinical trial is necessary to demonstrate conformity to the general safety and performance requirements. MDR specifies particular device groupings that would not require the manufacturer to conduct clinical trials due to an existence of sufficient clinical evidence or the ability to demonstrate conformity without that clinical data. So now the ever elusive question, what is enough evidence? I will turn it over to Stacy to help us define sufficient clinical evidence under the MDR.
The MDCG guidance simplifies some of the MDR regulations. And according to the MDCG 2020-6, sufficient data is, in simple terms, enough data to prove the device is safe and achieves the intended benefits. So what does this mean? Well, both the MDD directives and the MDR require the quantity and the quality of clinical data to be sufficient to demonstrate safety, performance, and the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. That's the important part. And they also require clinical evidence to be sound and the conclusions to be derived in a scientifically valid manner. But the bottom line is the determination of sufficient data is ultimately left to the discretion of the notified bodies. The MDR outlines 3 device groupings that are considered to already have enough existing clinical data, or they could rely on non-clinical data to demonstrate conformity to the GSPRs. The first device grouping is devices with well-established technologies, or WET devices. The second is legacy devices, and the third is devices exempted through Article 6110. Sarah, should we dive into the details?
Yes, so first off, let's start with the well-established technology, or WET devices. WET devices are referred to in MDR Articles 52.5 and 61.8. And while they're referred to in those articles, they are not defined in these articles. The term is not restricted to the devices listed in the Article 61 or 6B or 8, which explicitly states that this includes devices similar to the exempted devices listed in Article 61, which may be added to that list in the future. So to simplify that, MDCG 2020-6 provides some details about the 4 criteria that a well-established technology needs to meet. First off, it needs to be relatively simple, common, and a stable design with little evolution. Second, their generic device group has a well-known safety profile and has not been associated with safety issues in the past. Third, the well-known clinical performance characteristics of this class of devices and their generic device group are standards of care devices, where there is little evolution in indications and the state of the art. And finally, a long history on the market. And again, you must include all 4 criteria to be considered a WET technology. The MDR gives us examples of devices such as staples, sutures, plates, and screws. But next, we should consider whether the device could be considered a legacy device. Stacy?
How do we know if your device is a legacy device? Legacy devices are all devices that were previously CE marked under the MDD or AI MDD directives. So let's say a manufacturer has a list of devices that were approved under the MDD or AI MDD. This manufacturer now bears the burden of determining whether these same devices meet the requirements for conformity under the MDR. If there's anything that a notified body might consider a significant change, then they will require a new conformity assessment. Significant changes, generally speaking, fall into one of these 5 categories: changes to the device's intended purpose, changes to the design or performance specifications, changes to any ingredients or materials, changes to sterilization or packaging design with an impact on sterilization, or software changes. The MDCG issued specific guidance on significant changes, and we provide the link for you at the end of this presentation in the sources slide. And finally, we reach Article 6110. These are devices that don't really require any clinical data at all to prove that they are safe and effective and show conformity to the GSPRs. They can use bench data, performance evaluations, preclinical evaluations, and literature to show this conformity, and they are exempted from clinical investigations. Sarah, I'll let you take the next one, please.
So now that you have sort of seen the classifications, we see quite a bit that our clients often confuse definitions between legacy or well-established technology. So we've compiled a few questions to ask yourself regarding your device. First off, does sufficient clinical evidence exist for your device? And if your answer is no, that's where you should start to ask yourself if you fall into one of these categories. Is your device a well-established technology? Could it be a legacy device, or does it qualify for exemption for clinical investigations under MDR Article 6110? And perhaps most importantly, the last question to ask yourself is, does your regulatory strategy adequately support the clinical evaluation specific to this device?
We hope that today's webinar has been helpful in providing relevant advice and insights as to how the MDR defines clinical data sufficiency, what is needed to claim that your device is exempt based on the legacy, WET, or Article 6110 exemption criteria, and the importance of justifying your regulatory strategy to support these claims in the clinical evaluation report. We'd like to take the remaining time to answer some questions sent in by some of our webinar guests today.
All right, thank you so much, Stacy. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of our webinar. And now let's get started with our first question. Sarah and Stacy, let me know when you can see it on your screen.
Okay, yes, I can see that. So in a word, yes, the rules are going to be similar for IVDR with some exceptions. They have just recently put out some guidance for this. And by recently, I mean within the past month or so. So I am going to pop that into the chat for anyone who has not come across that yet. And specifically for this, what you're looking at is basically the updated MDCG guidance that everyone has been waiting for. They prioritize that because up until just several months ago, there wasn't guidance regarding what could be considered a well-established technology. And kind of referring to some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat, in the Q&A button right now, you can see where there are some problems with that definition for well-established technology, you know, and even to the extent where BSI doesn't recognize that definition, according to one of the comments in the chat. And you can also see some of the comments regarding what do you mean by a long history? What do you mean by no safety issues? How, like, does it really have to be no issues? So clearly the definition of WET has some fuzziness to it, so to speak. So I think that's a big part of why the current MDCG guidance has come out to define IVDR requirements to claim legacy, but they've also added this classification of old devices, which is new. So an old device would be an IVDD device that was placed on the market or put into service before the date of 26 May of this year, and that it was done in accordance with IVDD or whatever those applicable rules were. A legacy device is an IVDD device that was placed on the market or put into service after that 26 May date and until the end of the period. So there is some guidance now, but it's very specific pertaining to the date that has been imposed there. Really, the legacy devices are going to be the ones that are subject to more than usual PMS and vigilance requirements. And so if you fall under that classification of a legacy device, you are subject to IVDR registration requirements and some of the other sort of new hoops to jump through, so to speak. So that is definitely something you want to know early on in your planning process, whether or not you would fall under the definition of old or legacy. I'm not seeing much speaking to a wet device, which I think reflects sort of the overall trend towards sort of pushing the legacy.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Very well said. Let's get on to our next question. This one comes from Helene, and she's asking, what about well-established technology and legacy devices for IVD?
Oh, yes. So that is really similar to the previous answer. This seems to be a very common question, and you're definitely not alone. Everyone has been anxiously awaiting the publication of this new updated information, and it really came a little bit later than everyone had hoped, given that it was published in June, and it basically said that we're setting the deadline about a month before where we're providing you guidance regarding said deadline. So there are definitely some questions. And I do think that a lot of devices that are going to claim this legacy route are going to have kind of an uphill battle with collecting all of the data required to meet these new requirements under IVDR.
All right. Moving on to our next question. Alessandra is asking, for the first clinical evaluation of a novel device, what should you do when there are no benchmark devices?
Sure, that's a great question. I've recently dealt with a project that contained a device like this, and I guess the guidance that we received from the notified body was to consult MDR Annex 14, actually. And the three main characteristics they're looking for with, I guess, predicate devices in this case would be that you're matching the technical aspects, the biological aspects, and the clinical aspects. So you'll have to use multiple predicates in this case, and you have to cover all of those characteristics of your device. So maybe one predicate has similar technology, I guess, and one predicate has a similar biological mode of action, and then maybe another predicate has both the clinical, intended use, similar intended use, maybe without the technology. So you have to use a combination of predicate devices and just show equivalence that way.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question. What is the exact relationship between safety and performance, benefits, claims, and acceptance criteria?
This, again, is something that we're seeing a lot of folks using these terms almost interchangeably or kind of confusing the exact definition. I think all of us recognize what information needs to be in these reports, but we don't often recognize how to organize all of the information. And that's going to be a really critical distinction. So the safety and performance, those are the objectives. Those are some type of quantifiable measure that you can extract from the competitive landscape. They're used to derive your acceptance criteria by providing a range of acceptability. And your acceptance criteria will help you establish whether or not you meet the standards that could be classified as being state of the art. And benefits and claims are the two that I find are often mixed together. A benefit would be something that can be supported by the data, whereas often a claim is more sort of marketing language. So keep that in mind, because a lot of the information that we're receiving from clients regarding their marketing claims may not be well supported in the literature. And that is something to definitely keep in mind when you're aligning your intended purpose. If you are claiming a benefit for your particular device in multiple organs or in multiple tissues or something, you need to have sufficient data to support that benefit in each of those situations and clinical scenarios. In order to claim that as an intended purpose. So you may have extensive data on your device being used in one body system, and yet the other body system is completely lacking in the published literature. That would be a claim, but it wouldn't be supportable by the data that you're finding. And if you continue to keep that in your IFU, it's expected that you will need to provide some data to support that particular benefit or to support that claim that you're making.
All right, thanks, Sarah. There's a lot of questions coming in. Keep them coming. We have about 25 minutes left, so we'll keep going through and get to as many as we can. Here's our next question. This question is from Christine, and she's asking, regarding clinical data on a Class 2A legacy device, what is the main change between MDD and MDR?
Great question. Under the MDR, notified bodies are, encouraged to be a little stricter than they had been before, and they need to assess conformity using a different lens. And they're looking for any significant changes that might have happened between the time that your device was certified under the MDD and, now with the new MDR regulations, they're looking for any, software improvements, any design changes, any intended purpose changes, any sterilization aspects, along with those technical, biological, and chemical characteristic changes that we mentioned. So we do have, I just put a link in the chat that I think would be really helpful in reviewing those types of changes, just to see if any of those would apply to your device. If it's exactly the same and there's been really nothing except maybe aesthetic changes or usability changes, then you should be certifiable under the MDR, but there's heightened restriction, heightened scrutiny around the significant change aspect, and that would be the main change.
Great, thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question. Does an objective have to be a specific number, like a survival rate estimation?
So in this case, think about what the purpose of collecting this data is. Your overall goal is to be able to come up with a range that you can consider to be your acceptance criteria. So if you're trying to obtain a range, you need something that's easily comparable between devices. And we have found in speaking with some clients that they often struggle with, how do I identify, like, all of the data I'm finding is qualitative, it's not quantitative. And our main argument to that is that often there is a scale that is quantitative. So you may have, something like patient satisfaction. There can be what percent of patients are satisfied with the treatment, could be a quantifiable number. So I will include something in the chat here. We've tried to discuss this in one of our white pages. The importance of having something that is one of these sort of quantifiable, objective, and measurable safety and performance endpoints, that is going to make your entire argument a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to flow if you can have clearly defined safety and performance measures early in the process.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question coming from Angeline. And she's asking, EU MDR submission, is data beyond literature recommended for class 2B implantable, or is PMCF data collection in process okay?
So if your class 2B implantable device is a legacy device, then you could for sure get away with, if you're sure that it's a legacy device and your notified body agrees with that assessment, then you can probably get away with literature and PMCF data. But being that it's class 2B implantable, if it's not a legacy device, you need to collect clinical data on the performance of your specific device in a clinical setting. That's something that you would probably just need to consult ahead of time, do sort of a pre-consultation with your notified body or even your regulatory authority, to any contacts that you have there, to assess, just to make sure that you're classifying the device properly. But if it's not a legacy device, I would imagine you'd need to collect some device specific data, clinical data.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Here's our next question. Joanna would like you to discuss what level of evidence is required for different product classes. Sarah, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So I think this is a good place to sort of point out what they mean by level of evidence and just overall what their expectations are regarding literature searches. And this also came up in the chat. I saw that Robin asked a question about whether or not literature search and review can be considered as appropriate to support that clinical data. And the answer is absolutely. It's expected that you're going to conduct a very thorough, objective, very well documented systematic literature review process for your device. And when it comes to different device classes, I'm assuming the answer is, can we get away with less evidence if we are a lower risk device class? That's kind of how I'm reading this. I think it's important here to point out that the level of evidence is going to refer to sort of the overall quality of that evidence. That's how we're going to rank the strengths of the results of your systematic literature review and your research. So the level of evidence, whether you're a simple device with a very low risk or a higher device, is going to be the same. Your goal in the systematic literature review is to conduct quality systematic literature review and identify quality of evidence that indicates the extent to which you can be confident in the assessment that you're making. So the level of clinical evidence and the strength of your recommendation is part of the appraisal process, which will be required for all classes of devices. It's expected that you're going to appraise the literature that you're using to develop your acceptance criteria, so that the notified body has a good sense of what is the overall quality of the scientific data that's been published. This is where you can sometimes get into trouble if there isn't data sufficiency. If you're finding that some of the data has very low quality, or there just isn't a lot of data out there, that could leave you open to needing to have an additional study to be conducted down the line. But the final clinical evidence should have enough quality and quantity to show compliance with those GSPRs.
All right, thanks for that explanation, Sarah. Here's another question for you. Can multiple justifications be used to justify why clinical data is not required? For example, can a device be wet and a legacy device?
Yes, so Stacy, have you encountered this before? This is one that it looks like is popping up over and over again in the chat box. Have you seen, in my understanding, you kind of pick one, so that one route so that it doesn't seem like you're confused between the definitions.
Well, I believe that your device, it can, legacy devices in some cases are a subset. So a well-established technology, right? A established technology such as sutures or staples still could have been approved under the MDD and is now looking to be approved under, certified under the MDR. So a legacy device is more around the certification, and the well-established technology is more around how familiar everyone, all the notified bodies and regulatory authorities are with the technology or the mode of action in the clinical space. So it's kind of two different discussions, right? So yes, you can definitely be both. And the justifications as to why clinical data is not required are just around how much data can you dig up. And clinical data is always required. It's just a matter of, do you need to come up with your own clinical data specific to your device and conduct your own investigations, or could you rely on the clinical data that exists in the literature? And that's the question, right? And I see the question coming up too, what's enough sufficient data? And as Sarah said, it depends on the risk class of the device. I mean, if you're going to have a pacemaker or something like that, then you'd obviously want to make sure that that's the safety of that is proven in more than 300 people or so.
Yeah.
If you have a suture, you might be able to get by with, 50 people, and you might be able to rely on equivalence in many situations. So it just really depends on your situation. But if it's a well-established technology, you can definitely get away with fewer clinical investigation, smaller sample size, I guess, and smaller data set to prove your safety and performance.
Yeah, and as you're doing from a writer's perspective, I know it's really important to lay out the argument well and to be very clear in how you're claiming legacy or well-established technology. And that will also to have a very well-organized approach in your data presentation, making sure that you're showing not only the details of the different studies, but maybe you might need to stratify them by different patient populations in order to show that there is sufficient data for each of the indications that you're claiming.
Right. So for example, if you came out with a dental crown that was made up of a different combination of metals or alloys than, the products that are on the market, maybe you could use a combination of products, one that uses one of the metal components and one that uses a different metal component, and show your safety and efficacy using that clinical literature, and, see if that floats. And if it doesn't float and they say, no, you need your own clinical data, then you do. But it's an approach, using that justification initially.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. Moving right along, let's get to our next question. This question comes from Janelle. Do MDD essential requirements still need to be included with GSPRs in the CER?
So in most cases, the MDD essential requirements are contained within the MDR essential requirements list, but some changes have been made and more specific, specifications have been outlined. So you definitely need to use the MDR essential requirements list outlined in Annex 2. That's it, Olivia.
Okay.
That's
yes, and yeah. Okay. Oh, and here it is. So the next one, I think that's for me for the SOA writing in a PEP plan versus the scientific validity in a PE report. So this is one of our IVDR folks in the audience. So think about it like this. The PEP provides the story as to why the test was designed and what it's designed to do. So the purpose of the PEP is to assess the data that's already available to you that supports your intended use and the safety and performance and the benefits of your device. The discussion in that SOA section in the PEP should include things like the background on the disease and alternative testing options, but also a discussion of things like applicable standards and guidance documents. So the SOA and the PEP can include the acceptance criteria for data and the benefit risk ratios and the acceptability of, any sort of risks associated with the false test results that you're going to present as part of your performance evaluation. And it will ultimately serve as the justification for the amount of clinical data that you need to demonstrate conformity with the GSPRs. Now, in the SVR, that state-of-the-art section is going to build on that same discussion, but it's going to also include a justification for the analyte that you've identified, more details about the test strategy and the approach that that technology takes, and it will also include prognosis if the testing is not done or if the disease is left untreated, and the risks and benefits of all of the different alternatives that you've mentioned in the PEP. You also want to describe things like the frequency and the epidemiology of that test being used in the general population, and any of the clinical guidance or diverging opinions of professionals, unmet needs of the testing technology, if there's any particular limitations or cross-reactivity or interference, as well as the clinical hazards or risks associated with incorrect test results in the general population. So they're going to be very similar. You will see quite a bit of overlap, but the SVR should go into more detail regarding the analyte and provide that scientific validity for the test as a whole.
Thanks, Sarah. We've definitely had questions like this many times in the past. We have a couple different webinars and white papers as well that discuss this topic. So I'll send a couple of those in the chat for everyone to access. And here's our next question from Line. Should benefit risk acceptance criteria be the same as safety and performance?
Yeah, I've heard these concepts being used interchangeably and being kind of mixed and matched a lot. And I'm glad that you asked this question so we can distinguish between them. So your benefit risk ratio that the MDR expects to see in your conformity assessment is derived from a benefit risk assessment, and there's specific parameters around how to conduct that. They're not very clear in the guidance, but Article 62 does outline some of the aspects that they expect to see. The main thing to consider is that the benefit risk ratio is saying, if I put an 82-year-old man who needs a knee replacement on the operating table, is the benefit of him coming out with that new knee outweighing the risk of him being on that operating table and undergoing that operation, versus the safety and performance outcomes of the actual device, of the actual surgery, are how well does that knee work for him? How effective is that device in the anatomy? How many times is that surgery successful? So that's those are the distinguishing factors. It's the benefits and the risks to the patient of undergoing the surgery at all, of undergoing that treatment, versus the actual safety and performance of the device itself.
All right, great. Here's our next question. Does the number of years your search includes for SOA depend on the type of device you are writing about?
Yes, I think specifically if you are dealing with some of these legacy devices, this can come up, or some of these technologies that have been around for quite a while. There may not be a lot of publications that have occurred within the past 5-year period. Generally speaking, for the competitive landscape, we want to establish the state of the art. We want to know how are people using the device clinically in the most recent 5-year period. So in order to establish your acceptance criteria, you want to use only the most recent articles. And these can certainly include things like meta-analyses of older articles, but I usually limit the search for the competitors to about 5 years. If you find that you're not getting a sufficient amount of background information to allow you to fully cover that, the SOA search could potentially extend back a little bit further, but most of the time you can find relevant clinical practice guidelines or recommendations or some really solid meta-analyses that have occurred within the past 5 years, even for devices that have been on the market for decades. So I would say 5 years is generally considered to be the typical time frame. We have extended it for some specific cases where 5 years is not yielding any sort of results for the SOA search.
Okay, thanks for that advice, Sarah. Here's our next question. Debbie is asking if there's any differences or flexibility for Class 1 devices that have been on the market for 30 years. Stacy, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. Yep. Unfortunately or unfortunately, Class 1 has undergone a lot of changes between the MDD and the MDR, and primarily in the classification. Now they have a classification for measuring devices, Class 1M, Class 1S for sterile, Class 1R for reusable. And in addition to that, they've basically explicitly stated that if you manufacture Class 1 devices that are sterile, provided as sterile or have a measuring function, even if you already have a tech file that's in compliance with MDD, you'll need to revamp your tech file for the MDR requirements. And that's outlined in chapter 6 of the MDR. But in addition to that, all the post-market surveillance requirements are stricter, and there's heightened scrutiny, of course, around it. Class 1 devices used to be able to get away with a lot, and now they're not going to get away with as much anymore, unfortunately. So you can continue. Luckily, you have a longer transition period, so you can continue to declare conformity with MDD, and then just kind of beef up your post-market surveillance plan, your reporting, and revamp your tech file.
Nice. Thanks, Stacy. Our next question comes from Eva. Can clinical data for IVD RT-PCR tests be obtained by internal validation? If yes, how often does it have to be done?
So I think this is an important distinction too. With clinical data that's expected for your PER, there's going to be two types. You have kind of the data that happens inside of your doors. That's your analytical performance report, your APR data. And you're expected to provide the internal validation. I'm not sure of the exact requirements as far as timing for it, but that's the analytical performance data as it performs under ideal circumstances in your laboratories. The clinical data that will be presented in the clinical performance reports is basically how your device or how your test performs once it leaves your laboratory, when it's actually being used in real patients in real world scenarios. So that's going to be where that systematic literature review is going to be critical if you are hoping to collect data on your device being used in real hospital settings or real patient care settings. But it may, if you don't have sufficient data for your particular test being used in real world clinical settings, that could be where you may be required to do a clinical study to be able to support that.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll get to as many more questions as we can. This next question comes from Risa. How can we use recommendations to national bodies such as NICE to substantiate wet?
It's a great question too. As we talked about before, there are the 4 criteria that every wet device needs to meet. But of course, as we've seen in the question and answer chat, there are a lot of questions around what those 4 criteria actually mean and what is sufficient to meet those 4 criteria. And I think an evaluation from a national body like NICE would help you build those justifications and help substantiate your evidence around why your device meets those 4 criteria and why it should be classified as wet. But I don't think that an endorsement would really help your situation as much as they could actually consult with you on how to write your justifications.
All right, thanks, Stacy. This next question comes from Deeksha. Will PMCF data work as clinical data under MDR applications?
So yes, so this is going to be a potentially useful source of clinical data. The PMCF studies, they're designed to help you identify that potential for residual risks if you have a CE marked device, but also to collect data and gain additional clarity if there's long-term clinical performance data being reported. And so a clinical investigation and PMCF data are similar in that they're both going to provide that needed clinical data, but there are some reasons why PMCF could be more attractive as an option for many folks. In a PMCF, the device is already CE marked, and it's used within its intended purpose. And in a clinical study, often the devices are not yet CE marked for that intended purpose that's used in the study. So while the protection for those subjects are similar for both a clinical investigation and a PMCF, the PMCF systems are designed to help you produce more of that real world evidence on your device when it's performing in normal use situations. And that real world evidence really helps you support the requirements for MDR because it captures data from a survey population or a study population that represents the entire population that would typically be using your device. It's focusing on the safety and performance rather than making direct comparisons between different devices. So that's also very helpful information to know. And, it's not going to be part of sort of a formal study, but it still serves a very important purpose in your overall reporting. And so I would say that definitely, your PMCF is going to be a critical part of your clinical data that you're going to be reporting.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. We'll go ahead and answer Greg's question next. Greg is asking, can data on a similar device be used as clinical data?
Yes, we also get the similar device question a lot. And it's hard because similar device isn't defined. So it's either a predicate device or it's an equivalent device. It could be a competitor device, could be a previous generation device. So depending on what you mean by similar device, yes, of course, systematic literature reviews are designed to do that. They're designed to pull the clinical data and clinical results from similar studies with similar treatments, similar therapeutic areas, and compare them to, that's how you just establish your safety and performance outcomes for your device. So you'll definitely be using clinical data from similar devices. And if you are asking if you could use them to establish equivalence, you could also do that. Absolutely. It doesn't determine whether you'd still need to obtain more clinical data for your device specifically, because that would depend on the device classification. But definitely you can use similar device data.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. These next two questions sort of go hand in hand, so I'll put them up together. How do you determine the measurable acceptance criteria for a CER, and how can you establish acceptance criteria based on state of the art when there is a broad difference in values in the state of the art? And Sarah, do you want to take this one?
Yes, and this actually goes along well with one of the questions from Gulnaz in the chat as well. When it comes to your measurable acceptance criteria, I mentioned that it's really important to have that range. So let's say that your device has a particular safety, bleeding is an event. And if the bleeding occurs between 1% and 5% of patients, then that range is going to be determined from that's a measurable outcome. That's something that's reported in the literature. You've conducted a search of the literature. You've identified articles that report on bleeding events. You summarize all of these articles, and then you have established that range of 1% to 5%. Your acceptance criteria would state that for a safety objective, you want to be below that top end. So your device should be no more than that 5%. That's your acceptance criteria. Whereas if it's something like performance, it's actually the opposite. So if your performance is something like, let's say, like achieving hemostasis, if it's 90 to 95%, 5% of patients achieve hemostasis, you want to be at least at that lower end. You want to be more than the 90%. So the range is used to help you show what is currently published in the previous 5 years by other competitors that are very, very similar to you. In some cases, you may start to see a really broad range. Like let's say you extract that data and you've got a range of bleeding happens from anywhere from 0% to 40%. That's where I would strongly suggest looking at those outliers or looking to see if maybe you need to stratify your data based on patient population. Is that bleeding rate of 40% based on a single smaller study with a limited patient size? Is that a high quality study with a high level of evidence? Or maybe is that a particular patient subpopulation? Is it patients with a particular risk factor that puts them at a higher risk of bleeding? Those are important things to make note of, so that as you're determining your acceptance criteria, you are being very, very cautious in the patient populations and whether or not you need to establish acceptance criteria for multiple different populations rather than that pooled approach.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. This next one's an interesting one. Anna is asking about the impact if there is no clinical data on the technical file.
Another popular question we get. Yep, if you have no clinical data, then like we mentioned before, you can rely on other people's clinical data in some cases, depending on your device classification, or you have to go and conduct your own clinical investigations. Now, wet devices, legacy devices, and Article 6110 devices can definitely rely on clinical data that's existing because they meet the requirements to do so. And outside of that, unless you have a previous generation of the device for which you collected clinical data and there have been no significant changes, you probably need to collect clinical data on your device.
All right, thanks, Stacy. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Stacy and Sarah, for your presentation today. Thank you again, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. Take care, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.